Good afternoon. Can I ask the panelists to come forward for our next panel on recommendations for the future of U.S.-Africa trade and investment? Yeah, it doesn't matter. Okay, I think we should get rolling, and it's just terrific to be here. First, let me give many thanks to Corporate Council on Africa for bringing us together, for the U.S. Institute of Peace for hosting us, and I look forward to the discussion, building on the previous discussions that we've had this morning. So let me just get into it. Our panelists are David Olaf, who is an international trade enthusiast and trade policy advisor at Sandler, Travis & Rosenberg. David Kofi, who is CEO, is David supposed to be online here? I don't know if that's going to happen. Chris Legrand, CEO of Broadreach Group, has an in-depth understanding of both the public sector and commercial health markets, and Drew Quinn, Director of International Trade Engagement and Strategy and Policy at GE Healthcare. So, David, let me start with you. You work a lot on the Hill. You've got your ear to the ground on many issues, but I assume AGOA renewal. What are you hearing?
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be here as well. We've been working on AGOA for many years, perhaps not the 30 years that some of you have, but certainly over a decade working on AGOA issues and working with our clients also who are trying to look for opportunities and ways to partner throughout the world and source from throughout the world. I think it's important to understand the context that we are in this year's AGOA renewal process and how that applies to private sector investment and trade. Last reauthorization in 2015, the context was very different. Today we are in a context where a lot of the discussion in Congress is about China, and trade with China encapsulates the overall trade conversations in Washington, D.C., and the overall framework of policies for trade and investment. So that presents an opportunity. It presents an opportunity for supply chains that depend directly or indirectly to China, that are connected to China, to look for sourcing opportunities. And Africa has become, once again, very attractive to investors in many supply chains, from apparel to healthcare, from many others as well. So there are companies that are looking and are hungry for the programs that would allow them to trade and invest and look for long-term solutions. And with that, I want to also kind of emphasize, not to be, it is not a criticism, but it's just another perspective from the Undersecretary remarks. I do think that the long-term stability of AGOA is crucial. If we are looking, as companies are looking for new sourcing opportunities outside of China, they need to know that the program and the framework of trade and investment is going to remain for a long time. At least, we're very grateful for Senator Coons. I know his staff was here just not long ago, who offered a 16-year renewal. And I think it's very important that we talk about that, because that sets up the rest, or at least for many industries, it sets up the framework. For how long, if I invest not just a couple $1 million, but hundreds of $millions of dollars in energy or infrastructure, am I able to get that return on investment if my program depends on AGOA framework? So that's crucial for many companies. At the same time, we are in an environment of enforcement. So China, it's an opportunity to attract, but we're also in an environment of enforcement in Washington, D.C. No matter what, no matter who becomes president, no matter who controls Congress. And with that also comes concerns also of protectionism in the United States that could affect international trade. There's a band called Toto who has a very famous song called Africa, but that's not the song that comes to mind. The song that comes to mind is called Hold the Line. And that's kind of also where we are as private sector. It's kind of holding the line that trade matters, that we must continue to have free trade, that we must continue to focus on this, that it's in the long-term interest of the United States to have a prosperous and successful Africa. I think we have to think about that context and re-educate a lot of those who represent us to understand why it's so critical for the private sector that we have the right terms of trade policies in place. Again, I look at it as an opportunity in terms of people looking for supply chains, but also concerns in terms of enforcement and how that may create also concerns of if you're using, the last thing I will say is, if you're using materials from China in what you produce in Africa, there are some people who are saying, well, then you're using Chinese inputs and we can't have you bring in your products. Well, that's a problem because Africa still needs time to develop their own manufacturing in key sectors. So there is also an environment of opportunities, but also an environment of needing to push forward with the importance of this program, the way it was set up, and a long-term renewal of this program.
David, that's great. Let me ask you one follow-up question. There's a school of thought that says, look, let's just get AGOA renewed, another 16 years, we can do all the adjustments to it later, let's get it through. There's another school of thought that says, hold on a second, we should put tax incentives in there. We should do other things to really broaden this out and make it more impactful. What's your thought on that?
The private sector companies that I talk to are primarily interested in long-term renewal and knowing what the framework is going to be for that, and they need it now because they cannot invest right now in long-term renewal if the program expires a year from now. And unfortunately, the record by our lawmakers at this point is not very good on trade, right? We have a program like Generalized System of Preference that's been expired for 3.5 years. And I'm sure that people say, well, AGOA is different. I don't know how different it is when there's no time for trade in the congressional agenda, when there are other tax issues that need to be resolved, and when there are, of course, the politics that get in the way. So on the private sector that I represent is more interest in certainty than it is in changes. But that said, we welcome and hope for ways to increase, there's certainly investment necessary in telecommunications, in IT, in finance, that are important sectors that support the overall trade of goods. But we worry that all the conversations of making AGOA perfect, becomes a classic, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. AGOA is good. It hasn't grown perhaps the way that we want it to grow because China has always been there and it has attracted a lot of investment. But we have a lot of companies now that are saying, I don't know if I want to be there anymore. So it becomes attractive once again. If you look at, last thing I'll say, if you look at the AGOA trade statistics, when the program first started, the first 5 years, you see goes way up, lots of imports from Africa, and then China becomes a member of WTO, certain things start making China more attractive, and trade with Africa drops. So what I'm hoping to see is, once again, as China trade with the U.S. kind of slows down a bit because of the incentives Congress is creating for the private sector to look elsewhere, we're going to see again that sharp rise. And sometimes, again, we tinker a little bit too much, and it becomes political, then it becomes issues that are difficult to pass, and then September comes of next year, and we're not ready for an AGOA renewal.
Great, thank you. I see we do have our two other panelists. Let me welcome you, David Kofi, who's CEO of the African Association of Auto Manufacturers in Port Elizabeth, and also Melissa Nelson, who's General Counsel, Corporate Secretary of Sanmar Corporation. David Kofi, let me go to you since you're farthest away. You sit at one of the nexus of one of the most successful sectors of utilization of AGOA, and that's automobiles from South Africa. Very interested in your thoughts on your recommendations for the future of U.S.-Africa trade and investment, and specifically what the U.S. can pursue beyond AGOA to build a more robust and trade partnership in Africa, particularly in the automotive sector.
Whitney, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to Florian Laird for inviting Auto Africa to participate. So I represent the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers. So we're a Pan-African private sector association with a mission to industrialize the sector in Africa. So I'll respond from an African perspective. And we work with African governments to develop and refine and implement automotive policies and ecosystems that will attract investment. So we have a development plan for the industry in Africa. And I briefly want to share that with you because we invite US to participate actively in this development plan. So we're on a mission. And we developed a Continental automotive strategy in collaboration with the AfCFTA Secretariat, the African Union, AfReximbank. You've heard AfReximbank mentioned a few times. The Standards Organization, UNECA. And this strategy was approved by the Council of Ministers, the AfCFTA Council of Ministers in Botswana in February last year. So it's a living document, and the architecture of this is clear. It's driving production and trade across the continent. Not every country will assemble vehicles. Someone from the representative of Pfizer spoke about that earlier, was to say, what is a country going to focus on? How do we get scale? Certain countries will be assembly hubs, others will process minerals, others will manufacture components, and how do we create this industry of scale across Africa? And that is what we're about. Never before have we had so many countries in Africa either implementing auto policies or actually developing them for approval. And we believe that the current demand and production of around 1.2 million new vehicles in Africa can increase to at least 3.3 or possibly 5 million in the next 15 years. So it's a development plan. And obviously it will align with AGOA and with the US support. We can make this happen. So what's very important in this plan is that we bring in the new automotive economy. And there's a lot of work being done there. AfReximbank is putting up $1 billion to develop the value chain. There's value chain research being conducted across the continent. And we focus on creating linkages and partnerships in these new economies and bringing in companies who actually are in the value chain. But this will not happen by chance. It requires the deliberate leadership in the private sector and the public sector. And the role of the private sector associations across Africa is absolutely key to making this work. And we support strong, unified private sector associations, and they are forming across Africa. So what's very important for us is we see the continent as one, and it's important that AGOA is extended to include North Africa. The AfCFTA, when I say 5 million vehicles, it includes the whole continent. So we're on a journey, and beyond AGOA, we would like to collaborate on specific projects with American companies. And we would like representation, and this is what we propose, is representation in Africa. We would like expert auto resources to work with us, to collaborate with the partners I mentioned, and the private sector associations. Let's identify specific value chain projects and actually run with those projects. Let's drive demand in Africa for automotive. And we can do this, for example, by talking about standards. Let's not export clunkers out of the US into Africa. Let's have vehicles that come into Africa that are used, that meet minimum standards for emissions and safety. That's important. Otherwise, it limits the industrialization opportunity. Let's work together in implementing effective vehicle asset financing ecosystems. That creates demand. The more demand we create on the way to achieving the targets of 5 million, the more industrialization opportunity there is for companies in Africa and for the US. Let's recognize the US vehicle standards in Africa, which many countries don't do at the moment. Let's work together on mineral beneficiation projects. A lot has been spoken about that. Let's identify specific projects that are of interest to the US and interest to Africa. So we are promoting a results-based approach going forward. We think there's big opportunity in collaboration between Africa and the US. that will bring about industrialization and investment and trade opportunities. We can't trade if there isn't an industry. Let's create an industry and trade. And AGOA can certainly benefit Africa and America on that. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. Just one follow-up. I think many of us are very familiar with the very robust auto industry in South Africa. But in a minute, can you just talk about the regional input into South Africa's auto manufacturing capability? Because I don't think it's well understood, and would be very interested just to hear about that relationship.
Yeah. So to give you specific examples, I'm fully aware that Lesotho is involved with leather seat cover. They are very good from a sewing perspective, and you're getting an American company actually making that in Lesotho coming through. You're getting wire harnesses made in Botswana that are coming into the South African automotive program. I believe more can be done, and that work is being carried out right now. So it's critical to follow this principle across Africa, whether it's in the EAC or in ECOWAS or North Africa, to bring the region closer. Because we've also got to promote strong rules of origin if we want to industrialize. And we're only going to get that consensus if we bring inclusivity into it.
Great. Thank you very much. Melissa, you're second farthest away, so I'm going to go to you now. You're in Seattle, and just would love to hear your perspective on AGOA. Your company, Sanmar Corporation, is 50 years old, and that's older than AGOA. So clearly, you were producing apparel before AGOA, but AGOA happened. You changed your attention. Just tell us about that and what your experience has been, and what you suggest for making AGOA stronger.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. You're absolutely right. We were sourcing from other countries. In fact, in 2010, which is the first year that we started using AGOA, at that point, 46% of our imports, apparel imports, were coming from China. Right now, that number is 6%, and it's in large part due to programs like AGOA. We brought in 58 million apparel pieces from 6 AGOA countries last year. And we're looking right now at the expiration. I do worry that what I've heard today is a lack of urgency. So for a company like Sanmar, where the development of an apparel piece for even an established factory that we know how to work with is a year and a half. And you're looking at this expiration in September 2025. And no matter how many people tell our company, don't worry about it, it's going to be renewed, we have the example of GSP, so we do not have confidence that it's going to be renewed. And the conversations that are happening in Seattle, Washington with the business folks are, what orders are we going to place? Do we think this is going to be renewed? What is going to happen to the rules of origin? So, from a recommendations perspective, we need time. We need an urgent renewal now, ideally for a long period of time, and to maintain the rules of origin. The products that we pull in order to make our apparel, the third-party items, third-party fabric coming from third-party countries, are not made right now in AGOA countries. And in order to have the investment to do vertical integration, you need time. There's so much opportunity right now, and so much opportunity for investment. But investment in these textile facilities can cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's simply not going to happen until it gets renewed.
Thanks for that. I think everybody in the room shares your sense of urgency. And if you were here right now, we could all march up to Capitol Hill. But since we're a little bit more sedentary, we'll just take that on board. But I just want to focus on the opportunity here. Let's say in a perfect world, AGOA is passed, renewed next month. Tell us about the next 2 to 3 to 5 years as you see it from the Sanmar perspective of what you would like to do in Africa with a renewed AGOA.
Absolutely. So our sourcing folks are in these countries all the time, and not just the countries where we are currently doing business, but in Togo, in Benin, and looking at opportunities. And they come back to Seattle and they're telling our leadership team, we see these great opportunities to invest in textile plants, to work with partners, to, the way Sanmar often works is we give purchase commitments to other companies that might do the textile investments. We cannot make those commitments right now, but we're actively talking to folks. There are conversations happening all the time. You will see a big shift and a big investment as soon as it's renewed, if it's renewed in a similar, long-term and with the current rules of origin, so that we can keep using, what we currently have while these facilities are being built, which takes a few years.
Great. Well, it's great to hear that you're all in on the opportunity of Africa and AGOA. Thanks for that. Chris, let me switch to you, and let's talk about the digital space. You've got a lot of experience working on those issues, and obviously digital commerce is just so important globally, but particularly in Africa as well. What are you seeing in terms of integrated markets digitally in Africa, and how can this really become part of the AGOA conversation, which it really hasn't been to date?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for all of the organizations that are hosting this and the opportunity to speak briefly. Often I speak in healthcare conferences, and it's not usually about trade. It seems to be more about a whole series of other things, so it's nice to actually talk to trade people about healthcare. I've spent most of my career in the healthcare industry. Much of that was focused on the U.S. markets for many, many years, and then even later, international markets, but from a U.S. perspective. So it's been a real honor for me in the last 5 years to run an organization called the Broadreach Group, which is actually headquartered and housed on the African continent, headquartered in South Africa. So what I've been able to see really sort of with a foot in both worlds of both understanding U.S. trade and interest from a business standpoint, but what African nations and African businesses need and want in terms of trade and from a healthcare perspective. I also have a lens that I can look at as an individual angel investor. I'm invested in an organization in a pharmacy business in Nigeria, so sort of firsthand what some of the barriers are, which I'll speak to in a minute. Turning to digital, so the digital economy, if we looked at AGOA and one of the things that it really needs to help foster in its next round is helping to bring about the digital economy across Africa. You will have heard earlier about the digital protocol that was just passed under the auspices of the AfCFTA. That's an important piece that Africa is dealing with to try to eliminate the barriers to digital trade. We see that firsthand in the organization that I run, where, for example, the data in Zambia, there's lots of issues whether you can move that data to the cloud or whether it's safer to have that data sitting on a server in the Minister of Health's office, which I can assure you it's not safer. So there's lots of opportunities where American business can get involved in that and help foster that sort of moving to the cloud, transforming the African continent in terms of digitization. There's tremendous entrepreneurship, as many of you already know, across the African continent, not only in major hubs like Lagos or Nairobi or Cape Town, where I'm based part of my time, but in many other places, in pockets like in Zambia and Rwanda and places like that. So helping to foster that entrepreneurial spirit, and that brings me to the second piece of what I wanted to suggest is there's a gap in funding these entrepreneurs. There's lots of opportunities for seed capital, lots of things that USAID and others do to foster $100,000, $200,000 startup investments. And then there's the big organizations that come in and provide funding in the millions, largely for infrastructure kinds of approaches. What's missing is the gap in the middle. And other than in fintech, there's a huge gap in funding from the sort of 100K needs up to the 10 million. And we see that firsthand in the investment that I've made in this pharmacy marketplace business in Nigeria. There's not enough of that sort of $1, $2 million, $5 million Series A, Series B investment capability on the continent. And so when you take an African business like this Nigerian business that I mentioned, try to come to the U.S. and talk to U.S. investors and talk about investing in Africa, to be honest, there's still a lot of blank stares, a lot of, what do you mean, why would I take my money from the U.S. and invest it in Africa? What are the FX issues, these kinds of things? So there's a lot of things that I would think, and I'm not a trade expert, but I would think that we could help build into this next round of AGOA around filling that donut hole of financing and around supporting the digital economy writ large, because China is there, and I know this firsthand, living on the continent most of the year. China's there whether we are or not, and they're bringing their tech in, they're capturing the data, and so if America wants to be on the playing field with China from a trade perspective, we have to be in Africa fostering these sorts of digital capabilities across the continent.
Great. And just to follow up, just a quick question about digital health and what you see as the opportunity there and working with U.S. companies, again, in the context of AGOA. Do you think recommendations should be made to AGOA to promote that kind of commercial activity? Yeah,
that's a great question. The organization that I run, Broadreach, has a digital health offering, actually, that we implement throughout the continent, and we're bringing that into the U.S. market, so that's sort of a reverse trade opportunity. Microsoft is a major partner of ours, and so Microsoft, I think would understand the importance of building this kind of capability in digital health and other sectors. But the African continent, as I think my colleague Kate Talenko mentioned earlier, is woefully short on healthcare resources, human resources to put into the field. Technology can help overcome that and help empower health workforce to be able to deliver healthcare faster, more efficiently. And so digital health is a major component of that. And certainly American business like Microsoft and Google and others can foster that sort of investment.
Great. Thanks so much. Drew, that's probably a good segue to you, being one of the lions in the digital health space. Would be very interested to hear your perspective on what GE Health is doing on the continent and how it relates to AGOA.
Sure. So, GE Healthcare is now an independent company, not part of big GE, which has broken up into 3 companies. We are represented across Africa. It's a important set of markets for us. It's not our most profitable, and I just think that's an important sort of context that one needs to set, is that this if you're going to get companies like GE Healthcare more engaged in the continent, we have to find some way to ensure that it's actually going to meet the rate of return that we expect from all of our investments. Our CEO is also the chairman of AdvaMed, the Medical Device Association, this year, so or a couple of years. So, speaking not just from a GE perspective as the world's largest maker of medical imaging equipment, but also AdvaMed generally, and those include makers of implantable devices like stents or pacemakers, and also consumable items like needles and syringes or gloves or masks. So it's a big industry, and I think it's one that hasn't been as engaged in the AGOA process as it could have been. And so one of my thoughts in preparing to come join today was to think, okay, what could be done to change that? Frankly, AdvaMed, the association, has not had a position on AGOA up until this point. And that's one of the things that I think we're in the process of changing as we actually make people realize that, these businesses all have an active presence in Africa, but it was the nature of this tariff preference program, essentially, that it didn't really seem to have much in it for companies like ours. Now, I will say we absolutely support the extension of AGOA. There's a lively debate about whether it should be in its current state or amended or with add-ons. As someone who has many scars from trade policy debates up on Capitol Hill, my own sense is it's better to do other things in parallel than to potentially disrupt a process that looks like it might get to the desired end goal. But that doesn't mean that if you're going to attract more healthcare companies to engage in Africa, we don't need to do more, because I think it's not going to happen organically. It's not going to happen, by chance. There are a lot of very specific issues to the healthcare market with regard to things like product approvals, which is there's some useful work going on regulatory convergence, but frankly, the product approval process is still very murky and non-transparent, and it means that a company like ours, and I'm not just speaking for us, but others as well, that offer, a suite of products all around the world, are unable to bring a lot of them to market in Africa simply because the market is not viewed as being able to support the real investment necessary to get the approvals. And so I think that would be something that would help get companies more focused on the opportunities in Africa. I think it's important also to be realistic about where the kind of engagement and investment that African countries would like to see would be most likely to happen. I think clearly, if you look at the consumables market, that is probably the kind of area that builds most readily on some of the existing sectors that have flourished under AGOA, making bandages, masks, gloves. I think there's also a huge opportunity for parts. Machines like ours, our MRIs, have over 1,500 parts in them. Realistically, we don't have an MRI plant in every country around the world where we sell them. It's just not feasible. But what we do is we do have a global supply chain, and to the point that others have made, we are definitely looking to de-risk and diversify our suppliers now in the current environment. I think every US-based manufacturer is. So I think there would be opportunities there to have a focused discussion on how African countries, including the critical minerals area as well, can be a more active participant in supply chains for healthcare manufacturers. I would also say one key issue for us that is not addressed in AGOA, is not addressed in the AfCFTA, is government procurement. If you are in the healthcare industry, the government is your key customer. However, because that is not technically covered by WTO rules, because it is often excluded from free trade agreements like the AfCFTA, it's kind of the Wild West. And so if you're going to get companies to engage on the expectation of a predictable return, I think that's something that would be useful to find some way.
However, not technically covered by WTO rules, because it is often excluded from.
I think AI is taking over.
So, there are multilateral fora for those, and I'm not sure if we're at that point, but there's a lot that countries can do to commit to codes of conduct, to fair treatment, to transparency, to forms of redress that would give, large companies that are considering major investments in the country a guarantee that they will continue to have access to the market and that the rules won't change midstream. And so, I would just say, I think this is the AGOA extension process is a good opportunity for companies in the healthcare space to be thinking more actively about what steps are needed to jumpstart that process of engagement in Africa beyond what it is now. But we hope that we can have a sort of meaningful, substantive discussion about specific issues related to the healthcare sector.
Yeah, great. You've given us a lot to reflect on. Let me drill down on one of your points. You raised many, but and that is the regulatory obstacles. What do you think is the way to address this? Is this a capacity building issue? Does it need investment? Does it need partnership? Is it sort of a political issue, people wanting to get a piece of the action? What's the biggest constraint to easing the regulatory process?
I mean, you've touched on a little bit of all of it. I think clearly there are resource constraints in some of the countries. Clearly, capacity building would be useful, but I also, our experience is there are single points of failure where there are, shall we say, inexplicable bottlenecks, and that's where having a stronger code of government procurement and government regulatory practices would be helpful, because it enables you to sort of discipline these irregularities. And that, for all of what it's done, AGOA does not provide that. And so I think doing something like that in tandem with AGOA would help us realize its benefits.
That's great. That's great. I want to open up to a question or two, so please get ready. But David Coffey, let me come back to you. I'm interested in your 15-year vision, 5 million vehicles, because I think that's exactly the kind of ambitious vision that we should be having. How many countries on the continent would you see participating in the manufacture of automobiles to make those goals realized?
Yeah, so if you just look at the assembly of vehicles, and it's not an exact science, but I would guess that there would be probably up to 10 countries assembling vehicles. And it's interesting what's evolving now, and I'll give you an example of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Ghana is actually assembling light vehicles, and Cote d'Ivoire is implementing a policy by October that will assemble commercial vehicles. So you're getting specialization taking place as neighbors, and that's going to allow a bilateral ahead of the AfCFTA phase down. So yeah, I would probably say 10 and then many other countries involved in the value chain from minerals through to component making, depending on their comparative advantage.
And was that specialization, I mean, were those two countries, the officials working together saying, we'll do commercial, you do the vehicle, and were you guys involved in those conversations?
Yes, we promoted that. So we developed the policy, we supported the government in the policy development in Ghana and focused on light. And then we did research and proposed a way forward in Cote d'Ivoire, and it was actually for commercial. Now, you can't tell a country what to do, but what they agreed with is actually to collaborate with their neighbor. In both countries, they will. And when Cote d'Ivoire implements their policy, there will be collaboration.
That's great. And Melissa, I'm interested, with the products that you want to bring in, how many distribution points in the U.S., how many companies will these products go to? And I ask you this because when I go to a store to buy a shirt, the first thing I look at is not so much the price tag, but like, where's it made? And, I know we're doing something right when I see shirts that say made in Lesotho or made in Madagascar right next to shirts that say made in Mexico and made in Canada. So I'm just curious what your reach is into the U.S. with products from Africa.
It's a great question, and we use our apparel. It's basically a blank product. We sell to 80,000 companies within the U.S. that then embellish our product. So they are adding screen printing or embroidery or digipress and putting a patch on it, and then selling to their customers. We're talking about supporting hundreds of thousands of U.S. jobs. So, yes, you have over the 9,000 jobs that are kind of the direct employees that are working, that are actually producing the garments. And then you have the 5,500 Sanmar employees. And then you have all of the employees of our 80,000 company customers. And then you have their end users. So the reach is staggering.
Those are staggering numbers. Of that 80,000 companies that you're engaged with, what percent of what you're passing on to them or selling to them comes from AGOA countries in Africa? That's
a good question. I'm just blanking on the number, but it's a decent portion. It's not half. It could be a quarter, maybe a little bit less. We pride ourselves, and especially after COVID, from sourcing from a variety of countries. Yeah, we're in 20 different countries right now, but AGOA is very, very important to our strategy.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a real growth point as well. Let me just see, is there a question? Yes, sir. Please stand up.
My name is JP.
Here comes the mic. introduce yourself, your affiliation.
I'll do it short. My wife is here, so I have to do it short. She wants me to finish the question before I started it. But anyway, I'm the chairman of Industry 5. We are dealing with Africa in many respects. And I would like to talk to Melissa. It's a very touching story, and I feel for what you are doing. I'm, besides being chairman of Industry 5, I'm an attorney, so I read the law text, which is annoying, I know that, and boring. But I have a question to the panel, and by the way, to Flory. Thank you for inviting us. This is to Section 3 in the Improvement Act. And what is related to, any attorneys? You are talking, Melissa, about we need an extension, otherwise you cannot place the orders that is so needed. But there's another non-extension that goes the backwards way. The countries that suddenly are not a member of AGOA for certain reasons. And my question to you, Melissa, is because I've been traveling Ethiopia, and I have seen the textile industry totally dying because of Ethiopia stopped being part of the AGOA arrangement. And I don't know whether it was your customers or your suppliers. And then to the panel, very fast, can I come up with a question? A suggestion to Section 3, where very kindly the two senators has introduced that if a country is not behaving, they will get a warning letter, and they are throwing out of the class if they don't improve within the next season. All right. Anybody that has been working in Africa knows that nothing can be done in 1 year. So giving a notice of 1 year is meaningless. It should be 3 years. And I really think somebody should go to the two senators and explain to them this is meaningless. And Melissa, you might even go so far if you agree with me. Thank you very much.
So the short answer is yes, and I have said that up on the Hill. We did not leave Ethiopia. We've been splitting the kind of the difference with our supplier there, and we have raised prices a little bit for our customers. We've held on in Ethiopia, waiting, but if you look at the other countries where we are in Africa, and since Ethiopia was pulled from the program, everywhere else it's shot up. Our orders have shot up, our numbers have shot up, and while we've stayed in Ethiopia, it's a giant loss of opportunity for that region.
Yeah, I would just second that. I mean, I think there are many of us who feel that it's time to have a trade policy and it's time to have a governance policy. And to try to do both within one policy defeats both ends. That's a conversation that's active, but it goes to the point that I think we're talking about with Dave, about whether we get it renewed now or try to sort this out. So over to you, Dave.
And just a quick comment, that is one of the things that I've seen circulate as far as ideas on renewal, part of what Sarah Kunz put out as well, is to give Congress a little bit more input into these decisions of who gets kicked out and who gets to remain into the program. I think there's a little bit of frustration by several members of Congress who feel like maybe that trigger is being applied too quickly in some instances, and there's not enough opportunities for the countries to fix or show the way they're moving forward. And the other thing that is another idea that we're trying to float out there is to give countries an incentive to come back. So if you're in the case of Ethiopia, you've been out for now a couple of years, that companies like Sanmar who chose to remain in it to try to get through the political part but keep women and people employed, that those duties could be recouped at least to a portion. Like if Ethiopia comes back, that at least a year back of tariffs could be given to those companies that remain. Because like to your point, it takes a while to fix things. And once you're out of it, it takes, you got kicked out for two things, but now you have to, the threshold to come back is so much higher. So there's got to be an incentive for companies to remain, and that may be to give back some of that, what you had to pay. Maybe not all of it, but at least a big portion. That's something we're trying to get in as well.
Great, thanks so much. Well, we have about 2 minutes left. Kissinger, let me ask you for final comments.
Sure, I would just make one more quick comment just to pick up on the regulatory harmonization. Firsthand working on some of that. That's a many year effort, but I think there has been good progress made already. And I would say from my experience, there's not so much African nations and their regulatory authorities intentionally trying to create those bottlenecks. I think the reality is there are systemic structural things that just are not in place. I've seen regulatory authorities that are literally still tracking on a piece of paper, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of work that American companies and others can do to help foster that harmonization.
And I guess I would just say on the health piece of it, I think after the pandemic, a lot of countries are scrambling to do things to increase their healthcare resiliency. And so I think it's really would be valuable for the US and Africa to be engaging so we can head off like things that are counterproductive and drive up the cost of healthcare, but actually sort of fix things at the start.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I've got 3 takeaways. And the first one is renew AGOA now. The second one is renew AGOA now. The third one is renew AGOA now. So join me with a round of applause. Thank you very much.